and welcome to the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9 FM. I'm Paul Kretschmer. On today's broadcast, Katie Harth will be interviewing Mark Sorensen about racism and about recovery from the conflict that's going on in the United States right now. Because Mark Sorensen is deaf, you will hear the voice of an interpreter.
Today, we are talking about a very sensitive topic, and that's the events we see in the U.S. with racism and civil rights. And my first question for you, Mark, historically, how have movements like this, civil rights, racism, in the wider community, how has it affected the deaf community?
Well, hi, Katie. Thanks for having me. This has really had an impact on the deaf community in many ways throughout the years. So actually, civil rights was even really the beginning of making America a true democracy. They fought through rights for Black people initially, and then that had an impact on women fighting for their rights and on people with disabilities fighting for their rights as well. In 1988, at Gallaudet University, which is the only deaf liberal arts university in the world, the board was preparing to select the next president of the university, and the board had a deaf candidate, and yet they chose a hearing candidate to be the president of Gallaudet. And the student body and the faculty began a protest. It was known as Deaf President Now, and it was quite a protest. They closed the entire university because they wanted a deaf president now, someone who would accurately represent the student body and the faculty and staff. And they successfully made a change. A deaf person was appointed as the president. And so we understand that desire to fight for representation and leadership of our own people. And Black people understood that as well and were supportive of us. Another thing is to look at the 13th Amendment when it was first enacted. There was a clause in that amendment that said that people could still be imprisoned or forced into labor if they were a criminal. And that law was actually misused then to continue to enslave Black people. That's what I've learned from Black people. And we see a similar situation in the deaf community and in deaf history, where there was a Congress called the Milan International Congress on Deaf Education. And it was almost all hearing people present, and they made a decision for deaf people that sign language should no longer be used in the context of deaf education. Sign language had been a very significant part of the deaf community and brought us a good quality of life and good education, and the lives of deaf community declined in so many ways after that decision made about us but without us. And we have fought for sign language rights in order to have full access to education and information. And so we have learned from Black people's fights for their rights and fights for civil rights and benefited from them as well.
My next question is about deaf interactions with the police. And I have read articles about deaf people interacting with police, and it seems like problems spring from miscommunication. Is that often the case, or is it a case of racism where maybe the police officer is white and the deaf person is Black?
Well, deaf people do have some fear of the police because of the communication issue. If a policeman pulls over a deaf person, the deaf person may be concerned about being able to communicate with the police. There was an incident that happened at Gallaudet University in the year 1990, where a deaf person entered a professor's office and was arguing with the professor. And so they called campus security. And 5 campus security officers came to arrest this man, to detain this man, and they handcuffed him with his hands behind him so he couldn't communicate, And then they pushed him down on the ground in such a way that he was also suffocated and couldn't breathe and actually died. And as a result of that incident, Gallaudet policies were changed, requiring that all security workers had to be able to sign and communicate with deaf people. And so that was a very significant incident in our history. Another incident happened in 2006 here in Minneapolis. There was a well-known deaf leader who was very active in the deaf community, and the police pulled him over, and he pointed to his ears to indicate by gesturing that he couldn't hear. So the police knew that he was deaf, but when the policeman understood that, he tried to speak louder or gesture, and the deaf person gestured back that he would like to write notes to communicate. But the policeman continued to speak more loudly, to yell at him and try to gesture. And eventually the police actually pulled out pepper spray and sprayed the face of this deaf man, and then pulled him out of his car, beat him, put him in jail. And several times while in jail or during this process, he requested an interpreter. But they would come and try to find out how he was doing. And every time he would say, I need an interpreter. And this happened for several days that an interpreter was not provided. He went to court, and eventually policies were changed because of that incident as well. They would give training to police officers in terms of how to communicate better with deaf people. And so they've also created a card, an informational card that deaf people can put on their side window if they're pulled over that says, I'm deaf. Please communicate with me through writing notes or whatever, or please call an interpreter, whatever the deaf person's preference is. But it's important for us to be educating the police as well, that when they meet deaf people, they need to know how to communicate appropriately and effectively with us. So for Black deaf people, I would imagine that they face a double level of fear, because not only is communication going to be difficult because they're deaf, but they also face the racism aspect as well. And so often, I imagine you have heard of Black parents needing to have the talk with their sons to educate them specifically about how to interact with the police. And in many cases, that happens with deaf parents with deaf children as well. We need to give special education to our children to know about how to communicate with the police, how to be careful and not upset the police in the process of trying to communicate. Sometimes deaf people will have their phone or a piece of paper, a pad of paper in their pocket, and they will try to reach into their pocket to get that, and the police misunderstand that as them reaching for a weapon.
Let's talk about the third question, and then I want to end with a question that calls people to action, specifically hearing people. But let's talk about our third question first, and that was the type of mistreatment or discrimination of deaf people by the wider hearing community. You said there was a term for it, autism or something like that. Can you talk about that, and then we'll get to the call to action?
Yes, so oftentimes this happens even in the church, in a hearing church, if there are deaf people there who perhaps want a room to meet in on a regular basis. They might have a separate meeting of worship or Bible study, because deaf people's heart language is sign language, and so they want to worship and learn the Bible in their own language.
On today's WIHS Journal, you heard Katie Harth from Mission Network News speak with Mark Sorensen about racism and about recovery of the conflict here in the U.S. at the current time. Because Mark Sorensen is deaf, his words were heard through an interpreter. For further information, call us at 860-346-1049. That's 860-346-1049. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily those of the staff or management of the station. I'm Paul Kretschmer on the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from WIHS.